Places and Spaces was created to demonstrate the power of maps to navigate physical places, but also abstract topical spaces. My name is Katy Börner. I am the co-curator of the exhibit together with Deborah MacPherson. I'm an associate professor at the School of Library and Information Science at Indiana University. What we wanted to achieve is that we introduce people to maps of science in a way that reminds them of their usage of cartographic maps. And similarly, you can use abstract topic maps to see what kind of emerging research frontiers exist, what major researchers and papers and patents and grants exist in a certain area of research, and in general to get a more global view of what we collectively know.
My name is Deborah MacPherson, Debbie, and I am the co-curator with Börner. My interest is to do with how regular people, just, the general public, a teacher, could use maps of science. You've got all these people that make maps, and there's interest in how maps can help National Science Foundation and other people with their policies and understanding how science goes together. What I want to do is be able to make them that regular people can understand how to dial into them, how to move through them. And that's the point of these themes, is to keep addressing a new topic each time until it ends up that there is this little collection of maps, and if somebody was to ask, what do you mean mapping science? Like, what is that? You would, here's some examples. Here's what we mean by reference system. Here's what we mean by this.
My name is John Ganly, and I'm Assistant Director at the Science, Industry, and Business Library of New York Public Library. The exhibit that we're doing is in keeping with our responsibility at the New York Public Library for being the central focus for science materials within the library. I worked with Katy, Börner, and Deborah MacPherson to create the exhibit Places and Spaces.
This is the first iteration of the Places and Spaces exhibit. It compares and contrasts first maps of our planet to first maps of sciences. The first maps of our planet were not perfectly accurate, as people just started to explore all the different continents. And it is interesting to see that in some cases they just didn't know how to complete certain shapes. Similar in today's maps of science, we know we don't have the complete and coverage and the high coverage of the data which we would like to have. And therefore the maps of sciences which we create today cannot be complete and as correct as they should be. The second iteration of the exhibit compares and contrasts reference systems. We are interested to create a reference system of sciences which then can be used to overlay other types of data, such as the research portfolios of different institutions or countries. They can also be used to identify and show research frontiers.
My name is Kevin Boyack. I work at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I'm actually in one of the high-performance computing groups there. I actually have two maps that are co-authored with Dick Klavans in this exhibit. One of them is called The Structure of Science, and the second one is called Paradigms of Science. This is our first map, or our map that was in the first iteration of Places and Spaces, and it shows the structure of science in kind of a galaxy-type form. One thing that's interesting is that this map showing science in a disciplinary fashion allows you to look at the distribution of a particular topic over the entire map of science. And so, for instance, this little cutout here shows nanotechnology, and it shows that it's centered in the physical chemistry and physics and materials area. But you can see little bitty red dots spreading out through other spots in science, for instance, into biochemistry and down into medicine. This is our next iteration that appears here in the second iteration of the Places and Spaces exhibit. And we took a different tack with this map. What you see here are about 800 different circles that show sets of papers rather than sets of journals. And This map is something that we're now using to overlay other information. For instance, we can generate networks that show national strengths and national science strategies. We can generate funding profiles of different agencies. And a funding profile for NIH, for example, would show lots of money going into the biomedical areas. A funding profile for the National Science Foundation would show lots of money going into physics and chemistry. We hope that a map like this in the future can be used for educational purposes.
My name is Brad Paley. I'm a designer who specializes in massive amounts of information. And what we have here, fitting in with the rest of the show, is a map of science, showing how the different areas of science relate to the different areas of the world, as well as to one another. It's using a relatively innovative display technology called an illuminated diagram, which is an old-fashioned print and a projector that's controlled by a computer projecting light onto the print to help direct your attention to specific issues. This particular print is showing a map of 776 different specific areas in science. Dick Klavans and Kevin Boyack did the analysis and the initial layout of these nodes here. And what we're looking at is each different spot is a separate area of science. The reason it's laid out in a ring here is really interesting. It isn't laid out because Dick and Kevin and I wanted it to be in a ring. The way that we allowed the nodes to lay themselves out is we said, if you are related, then keep them close. But if you're not terribly related, for instance, chemistry is not terribly related to the social sciences, then the layout algorithm allowed these things to spread out. It's called a force-directed placement algorithm. What we're doing with the illuminated diagram part of this is we're lighting up the nodes. So right now it's coming through chemistry, and this is the more theoretical chemistry that's dealing with genomics. And that's causing lights to appear on this geographic map. But you'll notice that certain areas are lighting up. What's happening is as a certain area of science lights up on the other map, we light up only the places in the world that deal with that science. So this is a way of linking the two maps together. This is an abstract map. It's a map of the abstract concepts of different areas of science and how they're related. And it's very different from the very concrete map that we're all familiar with, a map of the world, which is really about real space. If I had to describe these several hundred different areas of science and say, remember this one, now remember this one, now remember this one, and this one relates to this, and this one relates to this, and you can see that you couldn't possibly begin to hold all that in your mind at once. The reason you would map science or any abstract concept in general is to take advantage of your innate ability to deal with space as a foundation, and then on top of that foundation, do your analysis. So here, in this lectern, we modified it by sticking a touch screen in. And I can touch the small version of this map, and I can say, what areas of science do I want to light up, and run my finger over those areas of science. And you'll notice as I run my finger over those areas of science, different parts of the globe light up. So we can focus on a certain area of science too by limiting this to chemistry, for instance. If we touch this button, it's going to show on the maps and down here only those nodes that are studying chemistry. Now we can look in both places and see how chemistry relates to the rest of the world.
My name is Dick Klavans. My interest really is trying to understand the structure of knowledge presented in a visual way that corresponds to the way knowledge actually is structured, to really get a really accurate representation, as accurate as possible, of how science is organized, all the different parts of science, and something that would be useful to a number of different users. I think there was a dream many years ago when I first heard about it was from a fellow by the name of DeSolo Price, that it would be possible to actually have a map for exploration for a variety of purposes, just like a physical map of how knowledge is organized. And actually I think its first applications was intended was for planning, government planning, to decide what areas to invest in and what areas not to invest in. The idea of the physical analogy, especially to something that responds to our eyes or visually, I think is very important because as humans, we really, I think, get a lot more insights through the through visual cues and seeing unusual patterns. From early being able to see what's on the savannah as threats and opportunities, I think we process information far better than that than in most of the other mechanisms that we have. And so this is a way to be able to take extremely complex information and yet present it in a way so that the unimportant details go into the back, the really important structural elements come to the front.
André Skupin, Department of Geography, San Diego State University, and moved there recently from the University of New Orleans. The problem is that there's an ever-increasing number of outlets for scientific publication and just the number of publications themselves as well. And so it's increasingly hard for scientists to keep track of the latest developments, and particular with respect to the growing interdisciplinary nature of science. So it's not enough anymore to just know the publications in your own field. You have to keep track of all kinds of other fields if you really want to work on the cutting edge. And that makes it increasingly, if you combine that with the growing number of outlets and publications, it's virtually impossible for you to actually read every single article that might be relevant. So we need new tools to gain, first of all, an overview of the structure of a scientific domain like geography or geology or mathematics, as well as the structure of science as a whole. And then we can also use visualization to, for instance, find information. So we can use visualization in terms of search and navigation, as well as exploration of science as a whole or of parts of science.
I'm Henry Small, and the name of my project is Mapping Science, and I work in Philadelphia at Thomson Scientific, which used to be called the Institute for Scientific Information, and changed ownership, and now it's called Thomson Scientific. And we generate the database that's used in many of these mapping exercises. It's called the Science Citation Index, and on the web it's called the Web of Science. It is an index of all the scientific literature in the world. Well, I think you have to understand, the makers of science maps are very much in the early stages of their evolution. There are no accepted standards, there are no equivalents of Mercator projections for science or any of the common things that you see in geography. And you also have to understand that mapping science is not necessarily a common sense sort of notion, because fields of science don't necessarily have a location. The locations that we assign to different fields can be completely artificial in the minds of some people, or they can be concrete. So mapping science is more of a mental map than it is a physical map. And the whole objective here, in my opinion, is to see if we can meaningfully understand the structure of science.
As a geographer, one thing that I'm very interested and excited about is that we can maybe use visualizations of science in science education, K through 12 and above and below, where science feels today very nebulous, very tough, hard to grasp for children and students at all levels. And if we make science more exciting by making these maps of them, we could, for instance, induce what you might call a sense of place in science, that students see, this is the structure of science, and there are these places, very real places in science, things that people do, and I might find a home in that place or in that place. So that's one of the promising aspects of it as well.